Well, g'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about the game-changing features of the Sony A9III. These features are going to allow us wildlife photographers to capture shots that were so hard to capture before. Freeze the moment that a kingfisher dives into the water or a bird leaves the perch. The features in this, the global shutter, the 120 frames per second, the pre-capture, the blackout free shooting, the list goes on. And I want to explore that today. Of course, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to share with the things that I didn't like, the shortcomings and how this camera can be improved. And also for full disclosure, Sony did send me this and their amazing 600 f4 lens here to test for a week. And they did fly me to the A9III launch event in Sydney, which I really appreciated. Now, I haven't been paid by Sony and they have no input into this video. All right, let's start with the most obvious and the biggest feature of this camera, and it is its 24 megapixel global shutter. This is absolutely incredible. It's the first full frame body to feature a global shutter. What is a global shutter? Well, I'll explain it to you. Traditionally, most mirrorless cameras that have come before this have had what's called a rolling shutter. That is, they're electronic and they read it sequentially line by line. The issue with that is if that moves too slowly, we get this distortion and this weird effect. And you can see this in my drone shot. I took this with the Sony A9III, which has a slow rolling shutter, and those wings are just completely distorted. And it's not just drones, you can also see it in all these photos here. The wings are distorted, the shapes are all wrong, the backgrounds get warped. It just ruins your photos. If you have rolling shutter, it's pretty obvious, and we don't want that. Now, the speed at which it reads that sender is called its readout speed, and older cameras, more affordable cameras, have the worst rolling shutter or the slowest readout, and the more expensive pro-level bodies have what we call a stacked sensor, and they're much, much faster, and they do a fantastic job of reducing rolling shutter, but they don't exclude it altogether. And you can see in this chart, which is a guide only, it's not 100% accurate, but it gives you a rough idea of how fast different cameras are. So prior to this camera, the current fastest was, I believe, the Nikon Z9, which had a readout speed of around 4 milliseconds, which is just a little bit slower than a mechanical shutter. Now, I took a shot of the drone to show you what a mechanical shutter looks like, and you can see that it's much, much better than those slower electronic shutters. We can definitely see the propellers. There is still some movement there, so it hasn't fully got rid of any of that motion. However, the downside to the mechanical shutter, of course, is it's loud, you're limited to your FPS, and we get some blackout in the viewfinder. So what we want is an electronic shutter that doesn't have any rolling shutter. Well, bingo, Sony have addressed that issue and they've created a global shutter. So instead of reading sequentially, it actually grabs it all at once. It basically reads the entire sensor at once instead of sequentially. And you can see in this graphic, which explains it absolutely perfectly. And now if I take a photo of that exact same drone with this camera, with the global shutter, you can see that it absolutely freezes those propellers in place. There's no rolling shutter whatsoever. And even when we compare it to the mechanical shutter, you can see that there is a difference. And that is what makes this so unique. You are able to photograph anything and not get rolling shutter. So you can do hummingbirds, you can do dragonflies in flight, sports, bat and ball, and you're not going to get these different warps and weird things going on. And you can see in this series of dragonfly images, which I captured with this camera, there's no rolling shutter whatsoever. There is, of course, a little bit of motion blur, which happens because your shutter speed's not quite fast enough, but that's okay. Sometimes we want some movement in our shots, so that's when we use slower shutter speeds to get that movement. We don't want rolling shutter, but sometimes you do want a little bit of movement. So with this camera, you can definitely achieve that. Just to demonstrate this, when I was in Sydney, we photographed a golf swing, which traditionally has quite a bit of rolling shutter. The golf club bends, and as you can see here, there's no bending whatsoever. Now, the majority of us are probably never going to notice the difference between a global shutter and a stacked sensor such as the Z9. It's only people that shoot action or very fast moving birds, etc., that will notice the difference and that will be excited about this sensor. However, I truly believe in the future all mirrorless bodies will have a global shutter, so we have to give Sony some credit for being first to market in this genre. All right, the next really exciting feature that I absolutely loved using in this camera is Sony's Precapture. Now, they're definitely not the first to create Precapture. Most other brands have it now, but this is the first Sony body to have Precapture. Was it worth the wait? Yes, Sony have absolutely nailed the implementation. Why is Precapture so good? Well, it allows you to capture images before you hit the shutter. So when you're in the field and you hit AF on to start autofocusing, the camera will start taking shots in a buffer and overriding depending on how long you have that Precapture set for. Whether that's a second or 0.1 of a second, the camera's going to store that. And when you hit the shutter, it writes those images to the memory card. So it makes it much harder to miss shots. So traditionally, if you don't have pre-capture, you're waiting for the moment. The moment happens and you hit the shutter, and sometimes you miss that critical moment just before you hit the shutter, whether that's a wing position or whatever it is. With pre-capture, you no longer miss those shots. So for example, I use this in the field. There's a cockatoo on a branch. I'm hand holding the 600, so my arms are getting a bit tired, but I'm holding down the AF on. I think I had half a second pre-capture, waiting, and then the bird takes off, and I've rattled off a heap of shots. And you can see here that I've managed to capture the exact moment just before it's left the perch, and then when it leaves the perch, and we have a whole range of photos to choose from. And I used it for a whole range of things. And I honestly, if Canon had good pre-capture, I'll be using it all the time, because I did with this body. I'm happy to see it shoots in full RAW and just writes straight to the memory card, and you don't have to wait for a buffer to clear. You can just keep shooting as normal. It's absolutely fantastic. The other thing that Sony have done, which I'm extremely impressed with, is they have given you loads of different times to choose from. So with Canon, I think you get 0.5 seconds and that's it. But with Sony, it goes from, I think, 1 second all the way down to, 0.005 seconds. It's basically, you can choose whatever you want. And you might be going, well, why do we need that? Why does it matter? Well, it all depends on your FPS and how many photos you capture. For example, if you've got 120 frames per second selected and you've got a second pre-capture, you're going to shoot 120 photos before you hit the shutter. And that's way too many. And it depends on the subject. I was talking to some sports photographers and they said, we don't want to capture lots of images. We only want to capture 2, 3, 4 before the action. So they've turn the pre-capture right down to like 0.05 or some very slow time, but it's just enough to capture those images. And for me, I think for a lot of my shooting, that's all I want. I only want a handful of images. However, sometimes you may want a lot more. So having that flexibility is absolutely fantastic. And for example, I tried to photograph a dragonfly leaving a perch. And these dragonflies are extremely fast. And I'll play you a video in real time just to show you how fast they move. You would never have the reaction time to capture that moment they leave the perch. However, with pre-capture, we can. So I set it to a second. I've held down AF on the dragonfly, waiting for it. As soon as I saw the dragonfly move, I've taken a photo. And as long as that was within that second, the pre-capture captured the exact moment. And you can see here, we've captured the exact moment the dragonfly has lifted off that perch. This would not have been possible without pre-capture. So in my mind, I'm just thinking of all the possibilities with this implementation that you'll be able to use. Something else worth mentioning about pre-capture that might not have been mentioned in other reviews because they haven't shot it in as hot as conditions as I have, but the pre-capture will stop working if the camera overheats. Now this isn't going to happen very often, but it did happen to me, so I'll talk you through exactly what happened. That dragonfly shot that I took, it was hot. It was like 35 degrees. The sun was out. I'm laying down. And to capture that moment, I'm in 120 frames per second. I'm holding AF on, waiting for this dragonfly. And I did this for probably 30 minutes, just trying to capture that exact shot. So if you think about it, in theory, I'm taking 120 frames per second every second for 30 minutes, roughly. And that's just a lot of load on the sensor. It's a lot of load on the camera. And the camera started to get hot, and I could feel the camera getting hot, and then I got a warning saying pre-capture is no longer available. I'm kind of surprised that the camera lasted that long, that it could take 120 frames per second for almost half an hour. That's pretty incredible. Now this is mentioned in the menu, and you can see it on the screen here, so they are aware of this, that if you hold down AF on for extended periods of time, the camera will get hot. But I need to stress, I used pre-capture for all my other shooting and I never ever got that hot because I was giving the camera a break. So I don't have a major issue, but it's just something you need to be aware of. So overall, I absolutely love the pre-capture in this body. And if it was on Canon, as I mentioned, I would be using it all the time. Canon, please update your pre-capture for the R5 II and the R1. Currently, it's just unusable. This is much, much better. So you've heard me say I shot in 120 frames per second. That's the other major feature of this body. It gives you full AF, full RAW at 120 frames per second. And that is just crazy. Like most other full frame bodies such as the A1, the Z9, the R3, I think the max for them is 30 frames per second. I know some APS-Cs have given us 40, and I think Olympus and Panasonic have gone up to 60, but this is the first camera that I'm aware of that gives us 120 frames per second in full RAW with AF. You might be thinking, I'm never going to need 120 frames per second, and you're partly right. 120 frames per second is extremely fast, and it has some downsides. What are the upsides? Well, they allow you to capture intimate moments that you might have missed. The exact frame of a kingfisher piercing the water, the exact frame of a bird banking with exact light. There's certain frames that are very difficult to get that 120 frames per second makes much easier. You just have a lot to select from, and I believe that if I had access to it, I would use it in certain scenarios. Not all the time, but for some scenarios, it is absolutely perfect. And I spoke to some sports photographers who said, look, when they're shooting tennis, the golden standard is when the player's hitting the racket and the ball hits the racket. They said to time that is very difficult at, say, 20 frames per second, and they've got to take multiple bursts at 20 to get that exact moment. But 120 frames per second, they can almost get it every time of that ball hitting the racket. So that's one of the major advantages of it. Now, Sony are aware that you're not likely going to shoot in 120 frames per second all the time. So they've implemented this really cool feature called Speed Boost. Speed Boost means you set your base FPS, say 30 FPS, and then you simply hold down a button, and they've added a button on the front of the camera. This is the C5 button. You depress C5 and you immediately get 120 frames per second. So I'm shooting at 30 frames per second. Oh, action. Hold down the button, instantly 120 frames, and hit a burst. So that's pretty cool that they allow you to go from your base FPS to 120 instantly. The other cool thing is you can set that speed boost to whatever frame rate. Say you never want to shoot in 120. Say you like a slower FPS like 10 FPS. Set your base to 10 and you could set speed boost to 30 or 60 or any combination that you want. For me, I think I would probably long term go 30 frames per second as my standard, and then maybe 60 with 120 occasionally. That's probably how I would shoot the majority of the time. Now, the other good thing is the Precapture adapts to the speed boost. So if you hold down 120 frames, Precapture will work on 120 frames, etc. It's also important I talk about the weaknesses of 120 frames per second. Like, it sounds fantastic, but in reality, how useful in the field. The first issue is that the buffer on this camera isn't as long as I would like. At 120 frames per second in compressed RAW, it can capture 192 shots. That sounds like a lot, but that only equates to about 1.6 seconds. Okay, so let's see what 1.6 seconds sounds like. And you can hear the shutter slow now. And it gets slower and slower. That's one good thing about Sony is on Canon, once we hit the buffer, you can't take any more photos. But on this, it will continue taking photos at a much slower frame rate. I think it starts at around 6 frames per second and will get slightly slower until you give it a break. But I still like to have that because at least you're still getting a few shots as opposed to none whatsoever. But in all honesty, 1.6 seconds isn't a lot. At 60 frames per second, you're getting about 4 seconds on the buffer. But a good thing is at 30 frames per second, it's almost unlimited. So if you shoot in 30 frames per second the majority of the time, you'll never have an issue with the buffer. It's only when you engage that speed boost or shoot at those higher FPS that you're going to run into an issue. And the other thing is at 1.6 seconds, that's 192 photos that you have to write to a memory card and then deal with later. And if you're doing that throughout a session, you're going to fill up your memory cards extremely quickly, and you're going to lose a lot of time trying to sort through all those photos. So there's definitely a balance there. And something else I found really challenging was balancing Precapture with speed boost. Because with Precapture, remember you're capturing those images before you hit the shutter, and we've got such a small buffer already. If I'm shooting at 120 frames per second and I have, say, 1 second of Precapture, it leaves 0.6 of a second after I hit the shutter, which isn't very long at all. So you can accidentally hit the shutter too early and miss shots if your Precapture's too long. So with this red rump parrot, it was drinking. I knew it was going to fly off. It's a bit messy to start with. What I wanted was to get it as it's flying above these logs. So I had Precapture. I forget exactly what time it was. Might have been 0.5 of a second. I've engaged autofocus. It's started flying off. I've hit the shutter. I've tracked it. But unfortunately, it's hit the buffer right at the time I didn't want it to. And yes, we got a couple of shots, but I missed the shots that I was after. So I think you would have to do quite a bit of field work to figure out exactly how long you want Precapture for so that you don't hit the buffer. It's just something you'll have to deal with and manage in the field, and it would take a bit of time, I suspect. That's probably why you're better off just shooting at 30 FPS and 60, because then you get 4 seconds, which is a lot longer. So why is this camera hitting the buffer? Well, at 120 frames per second, we're capturing about 2.5 gigabytes worth of data per second, which is a lot. And I believe the internal memory of this is about 5 gigs. So we get just under 2 seconds worth of shooting. That could have been extended if Sony had given us a bigger buffer. I don't know why they went to 5 gigabytes and say not 10. Might be a cost, could be an engineering thing, don't know why, but it is annoying for us as shooters when manufacturers create these high FPS bodies, but you can never utilize it because the buffer's never long enough, and maybe the buffer's too small or the memory cards can't write fast enough. The memory cards in this are obviously CF Express A cards. They have a maximum write speed of around 600 or 700. My testing was getting about 560 megabytes per second. So it can write around a fifth of the speed that it's generating at 120 frames per second, and that's why we're hitting the buffer. Now, CF Express B cards can write much, much faster than CF Express A, but they're not compatible with this camera. It's a choice that Sony have made, and I believe it's a little bit of a bummer that they don't have faster memory cards. Maybe in the future they will, but at the moment, that's the bottleneck on the camera. And one last thing worth mentioning is only certain lenses will get the 120 frames per second. As far as I'm aware, I think third-party lenses like Tamron and Sigma, etc., are restricted to 15 frames per second on Sony bodies. So they're never going to get the 120 frames per second. And I put up a list of all the lenses that Sony have told me are compatible with this camera. So if you've got one of those lenses, you'll be able to get the 120 frames per second. Just something to be aware of. Now, there's been lots of questions about the image quality out of this sensor. Has dynamic range and noise performance been compromised due to the global shutter? There's lots of videos you can check out on that. For me, I just wanted to know the noise performance. How did it perform at high ISO? So I did exactly that. I actually tested it against the Canon R6 Mark II, which also is a 24 megapixel sensor. It's not global shutter, so it'd be a great comparison. I shot my mate Gary the Galar at ISO 12,800, which is quite high, and here they are side by side. On first appearance, they're actually very similar. The noise is very similar, but if we look at it, the Canon has a bit more detail, it's just a bit more clear, and when we go down to the ruler, the numbers and letters seem to be a bit clearer on the Canon than the Sony, but again, they're very, very similar, just the Canon has a slight edge. Now, I compared this to the A7 IV, which is again not a global shutter, but it's slightly more megapixels. And when we did that same comparison, the A9III actually performed better. It had less noise than the A7 IV. So I personally don't have a major issue. Now, I took a photo of a Rosella at 12,800 in the field. As you can see, there is noise in the image, but we applied the AI noise reduction from Lightroom and it cleaned it right up, and I was very impressed with this final image. And when we compare that to an ISO 3200 version, you can see just how amazing denoise software is. It allows us to use much higher ISO, so I'm not concerned about that whatsoever. Now, I did have a bit of fun in the field with the A9III and the 600F4, and I captured a range of photos, and I just want to share a couple of my favorites with you now. The first one was this backlit swamp hen. As you know, I'm going through a backlit stage. I love this. I just like the feel of it, the color. There's just something unique about it which appeals to me, and I was very happy to capture that image. The next one was another backlit image, but the bird was kind of getting a bit of lighting around it, but it was dark behind. With some processing, I've enabled to create this photo, which I really like. I just like how the bird pops against that dark background, and overall, I just love this style of image, so I was very happy to pick that up. Now, of course, flight shots is what most people would be interested in this camera, and I did get a few. The first one is this cormorant just swimming across the water. We've definitely captured a number of frames as it's flying by, and the detail on this is absolutely fantastic. I love this shot. We also got that cockatoo leaving the perch, and I just like how its wings are just coming down. We've got the eye, and that high frame rate has allowed me to capture that exact moment that we've got there, which I really, really do like. And the last image is this yellow Rosella. The detail here is superb. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm very, very happy with it. And I guess it's credit to this big monster of a lens here that Sony sent me. I was able to hand hold this unbelievably. So I think it's only about 3 kilos, pretty much the same weight as my 500 f4. Yes, my arms got tired, but I had a lot of fun using that lens. Overall, I took some really cool shots, and I'm sure you will too if you have this camera. Now, of course, sports is the main use of this camera, and I'll share a few with you when I went to this event in Sydney. This is what its bread and butter is. We've got some Ironmen and women that went out into the ocean, and you can see just capturing that exact moment that they've gone up over the wave or they're sliding down on the wave. These are the sort of shots you're going to get. That's the ideal environment for this camera, and I was very happy with the overall image quality. Now in terms of the autofocus, they have added a few different features to this. There's a lot more things you can go through. It's got insects, it's got birds. You can dial down to the eye, the head, the body. They give you so many options that it does get a little bit confusing, even for me. Sometimes I'm second guessing myself going, am I on the right autofocus settings? Should I be trying something else? So I think long term, if I use this body, I'd be trying to find out exactly what the right settings are, because I still did struggle, even though the autofocus is fantastic with that shutter and the speed and everything about this camera is the best you can get. But even this camera can still struggle with wildlife. For some reason, these cameras still get confused with branches and grass and twigs, even when there's a bird in the frame. It is slightly annoying when it gets locked onto the background, etc. I didn't see a huge difference between this and the Nikon Z8, Z9, and even the latest Canon R3. They're all very, very similar, and they're all very, very good. In terms of the actual layout of the body, I'm very happy. This body here is much nicer in the hand than the A7 IV. They're very similar. They haven't made a lot of differences, and if you're a Sony shooter, you'll be at home straight away. But it's just slight changes to the grip and slight changes to the elevation of the shutter button. It actually feels a lot more Canon-like. Maybe I shouldn't be saying that reviewing a Sony, but it just reminds me a bit more of Canon now, especially with the grip attached. Very comfortable in my hand. It's about 1 kilo with 2 batteries, 2 memory cards. So it's not too heavy, it's not too big. It's almost the perfect size, and my thumbs and fingers, no issue whatsoever. So credit to them, they've made it good. I haven't even talked about the EVF. It's absolutely incredible. I think it's a 9.44 million dots. It's one of the best EVFs you can get. There's no blackout. It's a dream shooting. Like, there's no lag. It's just a great user experience. There's just great for action because your viewfinder's keeping up with everything going on, and that is a massive plus. There's also great image stabilization. It's better than the other bodies. It's got, not that I'm a flash shooter, but I believe indoors you don't have banding. You can shoot at higher shutter speeds. There's so many other features I haven't even gone into. I just wanted to concentrate on the wildlife features and what's important to me as a wildlife photographer. And in that regard, this camera really does excel. I love the 120 frames per second. I love the pre-capture. I love the global shutter. There's just so much to like about it. So in conclusion, I truly believe this is a milestone camera from Sony. This camera will look back on as the first global shutter, the first 120 frames per second, and all of those things. And cameras from now in the future will build off this and just get better and better. So we have to hand it to Sony for creating this camera. The big question is, would I buy this camera? And for me, at the moment, I would say no, and I'll explain exactly why. For bird photography, for wildlife, I love 45 or 50 megapixels. It's very hard going back to 24 once you've had 50. And the second thing is the stack sensor of the A1 and the Z9 is fast enough for me. I don't get that much rolling shutter with those bodies. Do I need 120 frames per second? It would be nice, but 30 is often enough. And the other thing is the timing of it. The A1 came out over 3 years ago. It's likely the A1 II will come out at the end of this year or maybe next year. That will have 50 megapixels plus. It's going to inherit all the features of this camera. It might not have a global shutter or 120 FPS, but it's likely to have 50 or 60, and it's going to have that big sensor. So for me, I'm probably going to hold out for the A1 Mark II. I think this camera is perfect for sports shooters. You're going to see it at the Olympics. They're going to be clamoring for it at the Olympics with all those different features. And if you do hummingbirds or bird in flight or fast action, again, it's perfect for that. But overall, I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with the camera. I love the lens. A big shout out to Sony Australia. They have been wonderful. The support has been excellent. My contact there, Daniel, shout out. You were amazing. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with Sony in the future, and I'm just excited about what's coming. So if you are excited about this camera, what are your thoughts on the global shutter, the high FPS? Get down with the comments, leave some comments. I love reading those comments, and others do as well. Thanks for the support to the channel. Thanks to all the new members and the existing members. Without your support, it would be difficult for me to make these videos. So until the next video, thank you very much. Take care. Happy birding. We'll see you in the next one.